to talk about the subject that everyone's been wanting to talk about all day. For some reason, we always leave it to the last part. Nature positivity and net zero. I get very excited about this subject. I hope you do too. So we have some amazing advocates for nature here. Let me introduce in order of how people are sitting. So first of all, on my left, we have Professor Right Honourable Carwyn Jones, former First Minister of Wales and Chair of Size of Wales. Just briefly, the name Size of Wales.
Yeah, we're a charity, and the charity was set up originally to plant an area of woodland of 2 million hectares in part of Uganda, and that is an area the size of Wales.
Oh, you know, because every time something is expressed in terms of environment in the UK, so say, I always think of this at Christmas, wrapping paper. There's enough wrapping paper to cover Wales, or the size of Wales. And I thought that was a very clever name, and I wondered if it related to that.
Well, it's become a unit of measurement. So why not use it as the name of a charity?
Well, you're very welcome here today. Thanks for joining us. And next to Carwyn, we have Elena Doms, who is head of Earth Plus. Welcome to you. You're going to explain a little bit more about Earth Plus in a second. We'll come back to you. Thank you so much for being with us. Then we have Patrick Begg, Director of Natural Resources at the National Trust. Welcome to you, Patrick. Nice to see you today. And then you feel miles away, but we're very close in spirit. Hello, Samantha Deane, Managing Director and co-founder of Kelp Forest Foundation. Welcome to you.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask each of the panelists just to describe a little bit more as an intro, who they are, what they do, and why nature lights their fire in the way that it does. But I will say this, I don't think that we would have been having this conversation even 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And, you know, the job descriptions and the organizations that we have now around nature, I just find it very uplifting. I'm just going to say that. Samantha, let's start with you. Can we hear a little bit more about you, please?
So we set up the Kelp Forest Foundation 3 years ago because we realized that there wasn't enough awareness, knowledge, or science around the benefits, the ecosystem services that kelp forests are giving to us as people, the planet. And so therefore, we wanted to drive the research, the scientific research, to be able to quantify these benefits. And this applies not only to wild kelp forests, but also kelp cultivation, which we see as the biggest untapped potential that we have of working with nature to be climate positive, but also benefit people. So this is what we work with 25 different research institutions around the world. We do research on carbon sequestration, on biodiversity, on the benefits of kelp-based products, which in turn go to help decarbonize other bits of the economy, like biostimulants helping to replace synthetic fertilizers, or alginates that go into bioplastics, or pharmaceuticals, etc. So we have at our fingertips today a way of working with nature in the ocean, which replenishes the ocean, but doesn't use land or fertilizers or insecticides, anything that is negative for the ocean. So it's really a way of working with the ocean to benefit people and planet while regenerating the ocean.
Amazing. Lots to talk about there. I'll be back. Patrick, let's come to you. National Trust being the largest landowner in the UK after the Crown. Tell us a little bit more about how you shoulder that responsibility.
Yeah, so 250,000 hectares of land and 5.7 million members makes us the biggest conservation organisation in Europe. We have a net zero target for 2030. That is hugely ambitious, but we're going to give it a go. And my role is deliberately opaque, so no one knows what I'm doing at any particular time. So Natural Resources Director doesn't mean much to anyone, but effectively I'm Climate Change, Sustainability and Urban Green Space Director. And why do I think nature's important? Well, there are some really practical reasons, that it sucks up carbon, stores it away, and it's dead cheap in giving us solutions to the problems we have. But the main reason I do this is because it nurtures the soul. And I have 2 daughters, and I would quite like them to have a livable future.
Oh, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Elena, let's come to you. I'm so fascinated by everything you've done. Tell us a little bit more about you and Earth Plus and why.
So super excited to be here, thank you. My name is Elena, I was born and raised in the Arctic. I'm LinkedIn Top Green Voice, and seeing my childhood home literally melt away inspired me to quit my corporate job, even though it was amazing, and to do something really impactful also to my little kids and all the kids in the world. Now I'm heading Earth Plus, where we have a crazy bold mission to create the largest soil and CO2 cleanup with nature. And it all started a few years ago in Belgium with a huge scandal around forever chemicals. The government went around, measured people's blood, concentrations were really high. And forever chemicals are everything that make things non-stick and water resistant. So they are in our phones, in our computers, in our winter jackets, in our frying pans, even in our paper straws, which we switched from plastic. And Belgium is the worst in the world when it comes to it. But because of forever chemicals and how useful they are, they do not decompose in nature. They just stay there, and they might stay there for millennia. Belgium is the worst in the world, but if we look at Europe and the UK, 1/3 of our lands are contaminated. And traditionally, we used to excavate those lands and put them somewhere else, but we can't literally excavate 1/3 of our ground. So a couple of years ago, my colleague, Frederik Verstraete, ran one of the first in the world pilots to clean forever chemicals from soils with plants. And that really demonstrated the power of nature, because they proved the impossible, that plants act like huge pumps. They suck pollution through the roots, put it in the leaves. The leaves were then separated from the plant, treated in a special process to get rid of these chemicals, and the stems were used to create circular construction materials. And when I heard that story, I was so inspired. I said, that's the only thing I want to do. Let's create the next ocean cleanup, but for soils. And that's what we are doing now, hyperscaling that model in Belgium and all across the world.
Amazing. Okay, I don't know where to start with some of this because it's just so fascinating. Carwyn, we heard a little bit about size of whales and why you set that up. I want to push forward now into a first sort of round of questions. I want to focus on what we can learn from nature and what the real value of nature as a solution to the climate crisis and net zero is, what it offers as opposed to engineered solutions, I guess. And I picked up on the experience that you have planting trees in Kenya. So could you speak to those questions for me and explain, why plant trees in Kenya? What is the job that is doing specifically?
Well, it's Uganda rather than Kenya, but we've planted 24 million...
I'm going to sack the researcher. Sorry about that.
That's all right, no problem. We've planted 24 million saplings in Uganda. They have, someone counted them, they have become tree cover. That tree cover has provided shade for coffee crops for farmers, and coffee is the main cash crop in Mount Elgon, that part of Uganda. It's provided a habitat for bees, again, a source of income for many people, particularly widows in that part of Uganda. And in terms of wildlife, it's created new habitat, or perhaps it's better to say restored previous habitat, and created wildlife corridors in an important part of the world for biodiversity. So for me, tree planting is important, but it's also important in terms of being positive in terms of nature. We've moved along now from the argument that it's all about net zero. Net zero is important, but nature positivity is part of that discussion that we're now having, which I very much welcome. But we also work with indigenous communities. they are in the best position to look after their own land, to help them to resist, for example, encroachments by mining companies, and they want to preserve their land and the wildlife that exists, the habitat, the biodiversity that exists within their lands. And also we work with ensuring that people take decisions that don't cause deforestation in the first place. Otherwise, it's like filling up the bath with the plug out. So we work with schools, we work to say to people, look, the decisions you take in what you buy will affect, for example, the demand for unsustainable palm oil, something we all want to see disappear. The two things go together. You know, habitat reduction is all part of what we do in terms of our everyday decisions as consumers. If we can change those decisions, we won't just preserve habitat, we can restore habitat, as we're doing in Mount Elgon, but importantly, we can create and maintain those habitats for nature.
And what do you say to consumers when they say, well, I would love to, but I can't afford to change to a more expensive product, say palm oil, for example?
Not every product is more expensive because it has unsustainable palm oil in it. What we found is not so much people saying the cost, it's people saying, how do we know? Not everything is labelled clearly. One of the members of staff that we have ran a little quiz for us to work out what was and what wasn't sustainable, and we were, I suppose, more informed than most people, and even we couldn't get it right. So there's a job of work to be done in informing people that the decision, how to take a decision, how to decide whether a product is unsustainable or not, because there is that impression in people's heads that if you choose something that is seen as more sustainable, it is necessarily more expensive, and that is not necessarily the case.
Okay, a quiz is always a great leveler, by the way. Samantha, let's come to you, because I can imagine you love this question, because you get to tell us about the deep benefits of kelp. How does kelp square up to engineered solutions for solving climate change?
Kelp is the Swiss Army knife of the ocean. It basically does have so many ecosystem services that just by restoring a kelp forest, protecting it, or even cultivating, you will be sequestering carbon. You will be enhancing biodiversity. You'll be deacidifying the ocean. You will be creating food supply for coastal communities. You can create products that create jobs. So I can go on and on and on about the benefits. And you are returning to the ocean as well. So you really have an opportunity to work with the ocean. So the regenerative aquaculture of kelp, you are mimicking and enhancing the natural benefits of what kelp forests usually do in the wild. So you are multiplying these benefits by cultivating it, and when you harvest it, you are multiplying the benefits on the soil. So the biostimulants that are created from the kelp can be made into biostimulants that then go to replace synthetic fertilizer that stop the pollution into the ocean. So you are creating that kind of circular benefit from the ocean to the land, back to the ocean. So the amount of benefits are, the amount of co-benefits are exponential compared to if you just did carbon sequestration with a carbon capture plant.
Elena, we're hearing about co-benefits, we're hearing about all these kind of amazing things that natural solutions are offering. What would you add?
Well, look, I'll be very direct. We're all fans, and we all think that technology and engineering will save us. The thing is, in the last 10 years, according to WWF, nature removed 54% of our extra emissions. Nature did that, not some huge plants. So we have to work together with nature. I'll give you an example, starting with forever chemicals. Traditional engineering solutions are to take land and to excavate it and to put it somewhere else. Does it solve anything? No, it doesn't. It costs almost 800,000 euro to do that for 1 hectare. Now you can work with nature, with plants, with fungi, with microbes to clean up soils and use that biomass to make materials that will turn construction from a huge carbon emitter into a huge carbon sink. I'll give you an example here. This is made out of plants. This one is industrial hemp. It's stronger than wood, it saves 1,000 trees per hectare, it's fully circular, so at the end of life you can chop it and make exactly the same material as before. And also it literally stores carbon. You combine it with the power of fungi or mushrooms, and this is made out of hemp fibers and mycelium or mushrooms. And then you can have a perfect substitute for engineered fossil fuel-based construction materials. So we just have to work together with nature. Nature is smarter than us. Nature is fully circular. And if we listen to nature, learn from it, and implement it, we can solve several problems at once.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing props. I love it when people bring stuff. I hope we can all have a good look at those later. Patrick, let's come to you. What would you add, and how do you sort of promote nature-based solutions in a national trust context?
Okay, I'd like to start outside the National Trust, actually, and just reinforce the idea that it makes perfect business sense to adopt nature-based solutions. So let's look at a brewer like Heineken. If you go and look at their new strategy, they've realized that they are in extreme jeopardy across the world around running out of water. So what they're doing is putting aside significant capital to invest in rebuilding the function of the catchments that supply their water. This is not a small job, but they are absolutely all over it, and that is a nature-based solution. There's absolutely no point in simply relying on mains water. We have to rebuild the hydrology of our landscapes. So that's just an example outside. I'd say inside the NT, we've been doing some work in the Lake District. So if people remember Storm Desmond, which ripped through that area, flooding small, medium-sized communities without any warning. And we've been working upstream from that in Ullswater, in the Derwent Valley, and rewilding, rewiggling the river course, removing the bunds and the levees and the channels that have been put in to drain land, allowing the river to braid out, rebuilding gravel banks. And the consequence of that are threefold, really. The first is it has slowed the water down, so the downstream communities like Glen Ridding have got time to understand what to do and get ready for any flooding events. Secondly, it's taken the peak flow off, so it's actually a less intense incidence. And thirdly, all those co-benefits that everyone else has talked about around nature returning. The salmon have come back into the river, they're spawning again. We've got invertebrate life like you wouldn't believe. And actually the in-by land there for the farmers is much better protected from inundation. I mean, I don't know that I could make a stronger case for just adopting it, and it cost almost nothing in comparison to building concrete, stone, and perspex defences.
Thank you. Very strong cases indeed. And it raises the question, why aren't we doing it all the time? Why aren't governments taking it up? Why doesn't policy reflect this? So what are the barriers to scaling nature-based solutions? What's stopping people, whether it be government, corporate, financial system? What can we do to break down barriers? Samantha, let's come to you for some ideas. What are the barriers?
I think in my mind there are three main barriers. One is financing, is trying to, I think the ocean, for example, is one of the least financed SDGs that there are. The SDG 14 has less than 1% of all financing. So trying to be able to finance projects, to scale them up, to do R&D, to do the research that needs to be done to quantify these ecosystem services. That's one issue. The other one is innovation. There is, when you go into the ocean, everything is a bit more complicated. You need boats or divers or equipment. And there is, seaweed cultivation and restoration is prehistoric in terms of technology. And the third one is government. So policy. You can't buy a bit of the ocean. You have to have a license to operate, either to restore or to cultivate. So if your policies are not enabling you to be able to do this because the policymaker doesn't understand the difference between seaweed cultivation and finfish, for example, then it could take you 16 years to get a license to have a seaweed farm, which is probably longer than an oil and gas permit. So government has a role to play to enable and allow this type of nature-based solution to happen faster and at scale.
What are the sort of solutions around that? I mean, is part of it education? Is it raising the profile of the ocean, which I think you've done really well? I'm saying you, but and you and your colleagues in the ocean space. And are there things like AI, and are there things that might make things move quicker?
I think education is definitely education and awareness. And for a lot of it is, how do we spread the word about these nature-based solutions? We saw some talks yesterday about communication of climate in a more positive, more hopeful way. That's what we also want to do. But also education of the government of what they have in their ocean that they're not even valuing. And that is tied to data, and that is tied to research. And all of that has to be financed. So if the government had a data that said your kelp forests are valued at 500 million euros per year, you are going to protect them, because you understand that if not, you're shooting yourself in the foot. So there is a certain education that comes from knowledge, from data, and that comes also from investing in the research that needs to be done.
And does something like the 30 by 30 or the global treaty for the high seas or whatever, do those kind of mechanisms help directly? You can say no.
It does to protect, for example, pristine kelp forests that could otherwise be destroyed, like they were, for example, in some of the coasts in the southern part of England with trawling, with fish trawling. It ripped out the whole kelp forest of the Sussex coast. So if you have marine protected areas, it does help. In terms of seaweed cultivation, it would be a way of how do you integrate cultivation with a marine protected area, and we understand that they shouldn't be exclusive one over the other. So it really depends how you set up these 30 by 30.
Okay, thank you very much. Elena, let's come to you. What would you say, what are the barriers, what's stopping this being scaled?
I will give you a concrete example. So what I showed you here is a little version of a building modular sandwich panel. You just put it in different types of buildings. And traditionally, one of the types is made out of wood and fossil fuel-based insulation inside. So with this huge retrofitting wave of our buildings, we are making fossil fuel-based insulation to keep the cold out of our houses. Now, this insulation is natural. It's hemp fibers and mycelium sprayed on it, and it grows in 7 days. In 7 days. So just imagine. We used to extract fossil fuels, emit a lot of CO2, send them through complex manufacturing processes so that then we can put them in our buildings. Now we can grow natural insulation on site in 7 days. This insulation also has better properties, so you need 10% less energy for aircon, because with the fossil fuel ones, if you have one of those houses, once the heat is in, you can't get it out. With this one, it's not the case, and it's much healthier to breathe. And you might ask, well, this is a no-brainer, right? It fits every box. But the thing is, right now, the governments are subsidizing fossil fuel-based insulation for our buildings. They are not subsidizing the natural ones. So how can they support? They can help these types of materials. And we are really lucky because we are at par at price, even with the fossil fuel subsidized one. But for other innovations, it might be not the case. So if governments really look at that and they really support nature-based innovations, it would be much easier to scale them. And how we can perhaps stimulate the governments to do that is through the power of radical collaboration and finding these innovative approaches where we bring different players together and make it work no matter what. Like, for example, we work with farmers, we work with construction, we work with industry. We bring them together and we make a solution that leaves everyone better off. But we need to find those types of solutions, tell about them to the governments, and make sure that the governments support them.
Can you hand that over to your chair, please? I want to see this miracle. Wow. And it's been tested, and it works. Where is it being used?
So you can use this insulation if you put it together. It's like a typical modular building element, and you can use it in huge warehouses, for example. That's where we are starting with. But you can use it in different types of buildings. And it's natural, fully circular. So at the end of life, we are tracing it actually with technology and working with Microsoft on that. At the end of life, you can take it and put it in a new building, or chop it and make exactly the same product as before.
A bit has broken off in my hand. I didn't do it deliberately, just so you know. That is amazing. Carwyn, what would you say about the barriers to you've held some pretty big jobs. You know what these kind of systemic barriers are.
It is a lack of innovative thinking, often in government. That's part of the problem. I remember in the course of the last decade talking to various UK government ministers and those in the Treasury as they removed the subsidy for solar panels in the middle of the consultation. They then effectively banned onshore wind in England. They then wouldn't move ahead with some of the proposals for nuclear, but finally they showed no interest in the Swansea Bay Tidal Lagoon, which was designed to be a sustainable power station using the natural tides of the Bristol Channel, the second largest tidal reach in the world. And the answer, well, there were two answers that they'd give. First of all, it's too expensive. Secondly, it's too new. We'd like to see other people try it first, and then we might do it ourselves. Well, what a way to present yourself to the world as a country that doesn't seek to innovate, but seeks to copy. And I think that's at the heart of it. We tend to be far too risk-averse when it comes to new, sustainable technology. We are far too risk-averse when it comes to reintroduction of wildlife habitats particularly. I mean, the debates that have been had about the reintroduction of beavers in some parts of the UK, you would swear that wolf packs were going to roam freely amongst the sheep in the upland areas because people aren't used to living with wildlife in the UK. They've got out of the habit of doing that. And that's what lies at the heart of this. We've got to change people's minds and the minds of those in UK government particularly to be far more open-minded when we talk about innovation such as what Elena's just shown us.
Okay, thank you. Patrick, we need to be more open-minded. Would you concur that's one of the things that needs to happen?
It kind of is. I think some of it's on us. So there's a bit here which isn't about exporting our problems to some other sectors. I think we haven't sold the vision very well. We've been pretty chronic at gathering evidence which can make a compelling pitch to people. I think that has been poor. We're getting better at it now, but the stuff that will convince policymakers and those who want to invest in the cost effectiveness of implementing nature-based solutions hasn't been there. So there's that. And then I think Carwyn's right, the creativity in government is lacking. It's dead easy to reach for concrete or an engineered solution. It's dead easy. We know how to do that. The fact that it'll only last 10 years is kind of irrespective because politicians work in 3.5-year timeframes, I think would be fair to say, before they're into the next election. So we've got to find a way to turn that government creativity back into our sector and our mission. So imagine, a load of brains must have been put to the idea of free ports and how you rewire financing to get money crowded in around manufacturing and development investment. Where's the green version of that? Where's the nature-based enterprise zones, natural enterprise zones? Imagine that catchment that goes out from Leeds up the Aire Valley, that river valley, sectioned off and say, actually, what we're going to do is we're going to attract investment there. We're going to make it fiscally attractive to put money in. We're the entrepreneurs who want to do nature-based businesses. It might be based on recreation, but there are a hell of a lot of other things. There are new ecosystem markets coming, but we need government to give it that kickstart, and it's just not got its eyes trained in that direction.
You alluded there to evidence, a lack of evidence. Do you mean data? And do we now have it?
No, we do lack data. We've got data on declines. We can say a lot about how much biodiversity is in trouble, and we can talk about some elements of nature-based solutions, but we just haven't got that widespread foundational evidence base that will compel people to put the money in. I've seen it in pockets, but we haven't joined all that up.
Okay, thank you. That's a very important point. Now, I want to go back to something that was mentioned before. And Carwyn, you were talking, I really got a sense when you were explaining what Size of Wales does, how this starts to join up. And what I'm really interested in is how the environmental justice can equal social justice. Could you explain a little bit more about how you approach that and what your work is showing you?
Well, let me give you one example. We work with an indigenous people called the Wampis Nation in Peru. And their land is under huge pressure from industrial, particularly mining companies. And we help them to preserve their land and to try to deal with the encroachments that occur on that land. Now, that is an environmental gain because the habitat that they live in, the biodiversity that lives there, that is all being protected. But it's also social justice. You're allowing people to live the lives that they want to live without being forced into doing something else because people with money say that they have to. I mentioned what happens on Mount Elgon in Uganda. It's not just about planting trees. It's about creating a livelihood. I mentioned honey being used. I mentioned, for example, coffee. These things go together. Environmental justice, the protection of biodiversity, goes hand in hand with social justice. And let's remember as well that quite often the debate about nature is framed as you can have nature or you can have prosperity. We know that's not right. We know that there are many parts of the world, and indeed in the UK, where people will go and visit a particular part of the world because of its biodiversity. And that indeed, of course, then benefits local people. We see it in Africa particularly, but we also see it in parts of the UK. People will travel and spend money locally to go and observe wildlife. And so that's another idea that I think we have to get out of people's heads, that somehow it's a balance, one or the other. It's either money or it's nature. Two go hand in hand. Environmental justice and social justice are inseparable.
Okay, thank you. We'll return to that theme in a minute, I'm sure. Elena, born and brought up in the Arctic, this is I would think this is a very strong point for you. Environmental and social justice, tell us how they're connected.
Of course, Arctic is a whole story, and I could talk about it for a very long time.
True.
If you're interested, please do come to me after the session. I'm happy to give you examples. But let me give you an example as well, maybe that is closer to here, to the UK and to Europe. Farmers. We have seen a lot of farmers protesting in the last year. They're under immense pressure. They have very, very little margins. Their soils are polluted. So in some cases, for example, in Belgium, soon farmers won't be able to grow food on their soils because it turns into being contaminated. Soils are also degraded. 52% of our soils are degraded now. It will be 90% by 2050 if we don't do anything. But let's have a concrete example of how we can work with nature to make farmers' life better too. First of all, you can work with them on nature and clean forever chemicals from soils. But second example is, let's say, potatoes. Who here likes potatoes in any form? Crisps, fish and chips, puree, steamed ones?
Yeah,
right, a lot of
house.
potato lovers. So farmers can grow potatoes only every 4 or 5 years for us to have the best nutritious crop and for us to have this amazing potato taste. Because potatoes suck everything out of the soil, so you need to restore this soil in the meantime. Well, if we bring solutions to farmers, for example, now we work with farmers to grow our crops as rotation crops. And in fact, scientists have proven that if you grow crops like industrial hemp in rotation, they help restore soils. They need 90% less water to grow. They need no pesticides. And they help increase the main yields by 5 to 15% at least. This means that farmers have more income. This means that they have more yields, they can have more money, and in the meantime, we make our soils better. In this case, we also make a better construction materials, and all of us have better food, because these rotation crops suck pollution out of the food. And we might not know it, but actually there was research that at least 20% of our food is contaminated with forever chemicals because we literally spray them on our crops as pesticides. In strawberries, that number is 37%. I don't want to eat that. I don't want to give that to my kids. And while using nature, we can clean that up, have better food, remove carbon, and have better revenues for farmers and create new local jobs.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Patrick, also like to talk about cities, not just thinking about the rural landscape here.
Oh, completely. So it's the starkest examples, I think, of where social justice and environmental justice naturally overlap. So our cities are incredibly grey. They're really not green, and they don't have nature. We've been doing some work to understand. Okay, so the most nature-depleted wards in the UK, we know where they are. Actually, it's heartbreaking to think about how many people just have no access to nature whatsoever. And it seems to me a pretty obvious thing that, because we know that proximity to nature and immersion in nature is brilliant for mental health. It's fantastically good for basic health outcomes. Lifespans are longer when you have contact with nature. It seems to me only right that we should, people should be able to rely on not being flooded out when the climate starts changing. Similarly, that when we get these island heat effects in urban areas where the temperature's getting over 35 degrees, 5 of the 10 days in the last 20 years where temperatures have gone over 35 degrees have been in the last 7 years. So these things are exponentially increasing, and cities are where that will be felt. It's 86% of people in the UK live in cities, and it would be utterly unjust to look only out at nature in the wider countryside. Bringing that back in, creating attenuation ponds, pocket parks, small bits of woodland, all of those things add up to, I suppose, what you might call a bit of a green string vest laid over the top of all our cities and creating all those co-benefits that I've just tried to describe. And they have an economic payback as well. Of course they do. Less flooding, access to clean, plentiful water, water companies not having to strip all the pollutants out of those. All of these things cost us money, significant money. Nature-based solutions put in those urban areas have got a blinding business case.
Thank you. I have an obsession with pocket parks, so I'm sure we should talk about those one day. Samantha, we're always talking about the sea and vitamin C and the benefits, but you think about when we're extracting so much or we're using it as a dumping ground, what are the real consequences for people who live near it, so coastal communities? And you know, what is the link between environmental action and social justice there?
There's a huge connection between obviously the ocean and coastal communities, but further inland as well. But talking about coastal communities, if you are in extractive industries and you're overfishing or you're trawling the bottom and getting rid of kelp forests, with those kelp forests go 800 to 1,000 species. With those kelp forests goes the health of the ocean area, so it becomes more acidic, or there is less coastal protection. There are all these ecosystem services that go away with this seaweed, with this kelp. So there is a big trickle effect on if there's less fish and there is less kelp forests, then there is less food for these coastal communities, there are less jobs, and therefore you are really depriving these coastal communities from very precious input for livelihoods. So if we, for example, restore these kelp forests, we are returning not only the health of the ocean in terms of better water quality, but we are creating these 3D habitats. There are ecosystem engineers which will then host a multitude of species that are commercially important or have a cascading effect, symbiotic effect between themselves. So it is important that we recognize that these ecosystem services are completely connected to the lives of the coastal communities. We work very, very strongly with the coastal communities so that they are aware of these benefits and that they can also maximize the benefits from having cultivated kelp forests. For example, you could make products from it, but you could also be growing in a multi-trophic way within the cultivated kelp. You could be growing mussels within the cultivated kelp because the mussels benefit from the deacidification of the water, or the lobsters as well. They love it there because they are calcifying organisms. And that symbiotic relationship also helps create even more abundance of food. And then also the kelp helps the land and the production of our food systems becoming a bit healthier. As you were saying, we are polluting our own food systems with all the synthetic fertilizers. So we also need to give other tools in the toolbox to the farmers to move away from the pollution of food systems through this.
Okay, that's brilliant, and it really nicely brings us on to our final question, which we're going to attempt to answer very quickly. We're going to talk about the food system, which many of our panelists are talking about already. What can global corporates and the global food supply chain industry do to move the dial and revolutionize the food supply chain based on all we've heard so far? Patrick, I'm going to come to you first, please.
Gosh, there's a lot. I waved my hands around so much I unplugged myself before, which is why I had to use this. So farming is critical. Just take the National Trust, 46% of our carbon emissions come from the 1,500 tenant farms that we have. So we've got a fierce interest in helping our farm communities to reduce their carbon emissions. But at the moment, they're caught in a sort of vortex of navigating by their wake. So thinking about all the ways that their business model has become utterly dependent on government subsidies, and the weirdness of where we grow a load of lamb and beef and export most of it, and then buy back from overseas the equivalent or more. So that there's some really odd stuff that goes on that underpins our food systems. We've got to break that down. But we've got to invest in the just transition. It's a really fashionable term, but I think it's pretty accurate, where we, a bit going back to those ideas of new business models and giving our land managers the sense of how they can still sustain the lifestyles, their families, where they've been brought up, but not feel like they have to hammer our ecosystems to keep just producing at all costs. And at the same time, of course, they're being rolled over by quite a lot of the retailers in terms of the margin. So it's a zero-sum game for our land management communities. We've got to break them out and give them a sense of hope and where they're going to end up by looking at trading on some of these ecosystem services. People are going to love it, but we've just got to be able to convince them and attract the capital.
Okay, thank you. Carwyn, I think you were Minister for Farming for some time, so it'd be remiss not to come to you.
Well, I mean, Patrick's identified part of the problem, and that is that we produce, for example, in Wales, lamb, half of which is exported, because that's where most of the market is, because there's no market in the UK for it. So changing people's perceptions in terms of what they should buy is important. But there's one other thing we should do as well. It's to keep on saying to supermarkets particularly, reduce waste. We go shopping, we see these perfect fruit and veg on the shelves in supermarkets. A lot of good stuff that's perfectly fine is thrown away, it's not used because it's misshapen or the wrong size or it doesn't shine enough if it's an apple. We have to change people's perceptions there as well and say you don't have to buy something that looks absolutely perfect because probably it doesn't taste that nice either. So reducing waste for me will be paramount in terms of making sure that we use more of not just what we produce but what others export to us as well.
Okay, Elena, I'm going to come back to you. I know that you've referenced crops and the work that you've done with farmers a few times. So tell us a little bit what needs to happen here.
When we talk about food systems and everything that we do, I think we aim to solve one problem at a time. That's why we need to fix something, we come up with pesticides or chemicals. We need to solve another problem, we focus on solving that problem. We need to start thinking like nature, because nature is complex and it takes into account everything. So when we look at the whole food system, we need to try to learn from nature, and we need to look at it holistically and see how we can make it all better, including farmers, including us and our health, including the corporates, and only then we can turn our food systems around.
And there, my friends, I'm afraid we must leave it. And I think what an amazing point to end on. Felt like we were giving the microphone back to nature at that point. I want to say thank you to our brilliant panelists. I really, really enjoyed that discussion. I hope you got as much out of it as I did, because that's the aim. Thank you so much to Samantha, to Patrick, to Elena, and to Carwyn. Round of applause for our panelists. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you. Thank you.